Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
For us, when we got told you're out of options, I looked the doctor in the eye and I said, I understand medically what you are telling me, but respectfully, I still believe in miracles. God has told us will give us a miracle story. I will call you when I'm pregnant. So that's a very natural way, in a very kind of aggressive way of doing that thing where you're coming out of agreement with a lie and into agreement with what you know is true.
Her name is Mia Fields, and she is our guest today. Listen, I love all our guests, but sometimes I'm a little extra when it comes to who we have on and the level of my love and respect for them, and today falls into that category. She is a Grammy-nominated songwriter, originally from Sydney, Australia, writing for Hillsong and Lauren Daigle and for King & Country and too many others to mention. You might be most familiar with her songs Christ is Risen, Peace Be Still, and Yes, I Will. Even before Mia took her first breath, her story is spectacular. And I'm just here to have her share the whole thing. So welcome, Mia.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. Mia, I love to start at the beginning of, normally I start, with gifts and talents that we discover in toddlerhood. But with you, because your birth story is so remarkable, I'm just going to ask you to begin us right there.
Okay. Well, I am the third born of triplet girls, and my mum was actually a single mom, and she was 21 when she found out she was pregnant and had us at 22. So, I mean, even that she made a decision as a 21-year-old to have three daughters alone, was pretty remarkable. And I don't think I've told this part of the story on any other podcast, but my mum didn't actually know God. But she said that when she was pregnant with us, she said to God, if you just make these kids healthy, I promise I'll teach them about you. And, I think God hears every single prayer, and he has a way of orchestrating things in a way to make sure that you can follow through on what you've committed to. So it's quite sweet. She ended up having us, and then kind of had a pretty interesting upbringing because my mom struggled with substance abuse and drug abuse. But it was like God was on her tail the whole time. God was chasing her the whole time. And in particular, she didn't want us to have the same life that she had growing up. So from a really young age, we ended up going to the Salvation Army, number one for food parcels, or what you guys would call food stamps. But number two, they just noticed these three little kids and a single mom, and they started picking us up for Sunday school. And so that was kind of how we came to know God, and how we got introduced to the church, it was primarily through generosity. And then, for me in Sunday school, it was through songs.
So, and for someone, most of our listeners are probably in America, the Salvation Army Church in Australia is different than how we know the Salvation Army here in the States.
Oh, I don't know. What's the Salvation Army like here in the States?
Well, or maybe it's just me. Okay, so I always was familiar with the Salvation Army ringing the bell in the kettle at Christmas, and it took me a long time to know that the Salvation Army was a church.
It is a church.
Until I met someone that went there. But in Australia, I think that's common knowledge.
Yes. The Salvation Army is definitely a big church movement in Australia, and it started in the UK. The founders are called William and Catherine Booth. And interestingly enough, that is the name of our daughter. We named our daughter Booth after William and Catherine Booth because it had such a big impact. And if it wasn't for, the Salvation Army as a church kind of taking us in and looking after us, I don't know that I would have the same, I don't know that I would have ended up even getting into songwriting. I don't know that I would know Jesus. I don't know that we ever would have gotten out of the situation that we were in, because we were living in my mom's car for 6 months, and then in a women's refuge. We got fostered out as kids. So the Salvation Army was a real game changer as far as getting us into a better place in life.
There's a quote, I don't know if it's from a pastor, I've heard you say it before, something about you can't really receive the gospel as well with hungry bellies.
Hungry bellies and cold feet. It's a William Booth quote. He was big on like, we're gonna be the church in that we're gonna make sure we meet the immediate needs so that we can meet the spiritual need.
So, a few of the songs that you learned, when you were literally learning who is God, you sing "This Little Light of Mine." What
Yep.
else?
Um, a song called Deep and Wide. It was like deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. And of course, the big one was Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Songs like This is the day that the Lord has made, I will rejoice and be glad in it. So those songs became such a massive framework for my theology. And you talk about people having like certain gifts from when they were quite young, and I think I always was like a little bit like, I didn't feel like I had any gifts when I was young. I felt like I had to work really hard at a lot of things. Songwriting wasn't something that just came naturally to me. I wasn't naturally super, pick up a guitar and just go for it. I wasn't the person that opened my mouth and sing and it's like stops traffic. That wasn't me. But when I look back now, I think from a really young age, I think I did have a big faith gift because I would sing these songs and think, well, yeah, like, of course Jesus loves me. Yes. Okay. Well, that must be true. I'm convinced that that's real. I would, when I became a Christian, I was 5 years old and I put up my hand at Sunday school and said a prayer. And then that, like 2 days later, the Salvation Army officers came to my mom's house and kind of explained to her, Mia's given her life to Jesus Christ. And they gave me this little book called Hello, God, Are You There? And it's like, it was just this picture storybook of this little kid. And he was like, in bed and he was frightened. And he said, God, I'm frightened. It's dark and I just need to know you're there. Are you there? And God's like, I'm here. I'm always here. And I remember like looking back, I'm like, that book was like such a massive part of my whole belief system today. And I don't think it's the book was particularly profound, but I think I would read these statements and like, ultimately it was like the gospel, but in like kid form. I would read these statements and in my heart, I would be in such agreement with them. So I think from a really young age, I just had this faith gift where I like, oh yeah, I'm convinced that that's real.
Mhm. And didn't your sisters wanted the book, so they went and accepted the Lord?
They did. Like, I remember the day they came to the house, the Salvation Army. I was in the shower the day they came to the house and I came out in a towel and a t-shirt, I think. And they explained to my mom, explained to me, and then they gave me a free book. And I think my sisters were like, hang on a second, I want a free book. So then they did it too. But fortunately it's worked out and they still love Jesus. So
I love that, you've gone through, is it seminary, like Bible school? Like, you've done so much study of God's word and songwriting, but yet your theology has not changed much from
oh no,
those
like
songs.
I think the more that I know, the more that I go back to the simple things. Like, you know, God has said He'll never leave us or forsake us, so we can say with confidence, "I won't be afraid." That to I think probably that's like the biggest cornerstone of my whole belief system is that God's with me, and so everything's going to be okay.
You and I share a similarity in that middle school, high school, all that was not particular that's not where we peaked.
You
I
don't want to
carried
peak. You don't want to peak in middle school or high school. Everything should be a journey of glory to glory and strength to strength.
You carried a tuba, I carried a violin, we both
We
had
probably
glasses
would have been
before.
best friends. Like,
That would be great, that would have made one of you. So
yes.
but, talk to me about those years.
you know, my husband has this saying. It's probably a quote from somewhere, but I'm going to give him the credit for it because I don't know where the quote's from. So, but he always says, the path to intimacy and closeness with God passes through the valley of profound loneliness. And, you know, I think I look back at life, particularly my years at school, and I am at the time probably wasn't, but now I'm incredibly grateful for those like really hidden seasons and those really lonely seasons because it's really easy to put God aside when you have everyone. When you have no one and all you have is God, that's when you get to know him as your best friend because he's all you got. So, those years in high school, I didn't feel I probably felt a little bit lonely, but not alone. And like they were such big years in shaping, you know, a prophetic gift and a gift of learning how to hear the voice of God for myself, learning how to like lean in and like learning how to pray, learning how to go to the word and counteract some of those lies and that I was believing or that I'd heard, in those teenage years, like, you're not good enough, you're never going to amount to anything. Okay, but what does the word say? When you're the last choice every time, what does the word of God say? So, I actually am incredibly grateful for those years. And I say this all the time, for anyone who's listening, you might feel like you're in a season where like everything is just hidden, and I say like quite a bit, there's a difference between being unseen and being hidden. Hidden things are protected things. Hidden things are like treasured things. And, life is a journey of like manifest seasons and hidden seasons. And, even in the Bible, we look at that where it's like, you look at like Joseph's story, David's story, when David was like the 8th choice or the 7th or 8th choice, like, when they came to anoint a king, he wasn't the guy. They pretty much were about to pack up and leave shop and be like, oh, well, there's no one here to anoint, except that God spoke and God pulled him out of obscurity. But it wasn't, David didn't learn to be a king and didn't like get anointed because he was like the most seen. He was like out in the fields just doing what he needed to do and seeking God. And so I think, it's those like, years of sitting in the field of obscurity or the field that's hidden, like that shape your whole story. Because it was like when I was in those years of loneliness at school and like, not really having anyone at school that I started to get a passion for like what I was called to do. It's like those years that I was like, I'd love to write songs one day, where I started to work on the craft of lyric, So I think, don't be afraid of a hidden season.
Or even more so, get excited.
Oh my gosh, yes. I've just been in a hidden season the last couple of years and I'm like, oh, how exciting. Like, I wonder what's coming. And did I use the time well? Did I, you don't have to like just produce fruit in one season. Yes, there are seasons of like, seasons to grow and seasons to plant. But like the planting season is incredibly exciting because only you know what you've sown, and like, sowing and reaping is a biblical principle. So I'm like, if you're in a hidden season, get to putting seed in the ground because how exciting. You're going to reap the harvest on it eventually.
You also had, I think, the verse, many are called, but few are chosen. Am I getting that right?
Yes, that was like my verse as a kid because I was always the last choice for everything or no choice at all. And like, when like if I would go to these like summer camps as a teenager and like everybody would get a prophetic word and I would get none. Like I remember one summer camp in particular, it was quite funny. Like, I mean, it was like, it was amazing. Like, it's like having revivals breaking out. There's like, 40 kids and like, we're just going for it and like singing our hearts out to God, like crying. Like it was just beautiful what God was doing. And then there was this prophetic minister there and he was giving everyone prophetic words. And then the night's kind of going on and like I'm the last person in line. So I'm thinking I'm going to get the best word. Well, right as he gets to me, he kind of packs up and is like, okay, cool, let's go get dessert. And I was like standing there being like, but I didn't get my word. And I don't know if it's just because he just didn't see me, but I didn't get a word. And it was like, and it was in that moment that you have a choice where you go like, oh, I'm overlooked and like I didn't get the word, so I'm not special or whatever. Or you get bitter. In that moment, as like a 13 or 14-year-old, everybody went and got dessert, and I laid hands on myself after the musicians had walked off the stage, and I laid hands on myself and I prophesied over myself. And it was such a defining moment of realizing you do not need, like as beautiful as a prophetic word is, you do not need someone to tell you secondhand what God can tell you firsthand. And it was a good opportunity to exercise like even a gift that God has given all of us. Like God has put creative words in your mouth. God has given you the ability to exhort, to encourage, to prophesy. Like why can't you do it for yourself, And so I would I would say, one day I'm going to write songs that go all over the world. God, one day I'm going to tell people about you. One day, like, you're going to use me for something special. Even if nobody can see it now, God, you're going to use me for something special. You're going to give me divine friendships that are lifelong friendships, people that are friends to my destiny. And I would say this stuff all over myself. And now as a nearly 42-year-old, I look back and I think God did not miss a beat. Like, I could have waited for somebody else to speak that over me, or I could speak it over myself now. And that kind of set up a pattern for me that, like, when I wasn't seeing things happen, or when I was in a season of kind of silence, I would go back to the promises of God and I would declare them over myself, And I've spoken a lot about this in the past, but I'm not a big believer of begging God for things, because I think I don't ever go to my dad and beg my dad for anything. I'm a big believer of declaring what he's already said, and sometimes speaking it out is the way that you're coming into agreement with it, and your agreement with heaven is incredibly important.
Talk more about that.
Okay, so I think that depending on what kind of church you grew up in, I grew up in a very kooky church, which I kind of love kooky church. Everyone was rolling around on the floor and stuff in my church that I grew up in. And I am here for that. But I'm also here for let's stand in church, incredibly reverent, and let's sit in the silence and let God speak to us. I'm all about that. I think the church is quite beautiful. It's quite colorful and has many, many functions and many, many different parts. So I'm all about both. But, we talk about something like strongholds. You hear it's a stronghold or whatever. And lots of people, I think, don't know what that means. A stronghold in your life, is usually something that it doesn't matter how much you pray, you can't seem to get past it. So let's say, for example, you can't seem to get on top of your anger. No matter what, you just can't get on top of your anger. Well, perhaps it's a stronghold in your life. We're talking about agreement. Well, a stronghold is really just a lie that you've come into agreement with so much that it's given the enemy a highway to run on. He now has so much room to move in this area. Well, how much more powerful for you to come out of agreement with a lie, shut the highway down, and create a new highway for God to move on. And the way you do that is you, like I said, come out of agreement with the lie and come into agreement with the truth of what God has said. So for me, one thing, this is kind of jumping around a little bit, but one thing, recently in the last, 5 years that we got told, 6-7 years that we got told, was we couldn't have children. A doctor had said to us, it's not going to happen for you. You are out of options. And the reality was I had really large tumors in my womb that kept growing no matter how many times we cut them out. Now, it'd be really easy for me to be in agreement with a doctor after multiple surgeries, losing an ovary and being nearly 40. It'd be very easy for me to be in agreement with how it looks in the natural, and with the words of a doctor saying, you're out of options, it's not going to happen for you. I have a choice then, and sometimes it's the words of maybe a doctor, maybe it's someone who has spoken something over you. Maybe you're believing God to get married and you're you've just turned 45 and people are it's kind of not going to happen for you. You're too old. You live in the South, whatever. Well, they don't have any power to bring something about in your life outside of your agreement. So for us, when we got told you're out of options, I looked the doctor in the eye and I said, I understand medically what you are telling me, but respectfully, I still believe in miracles. God has told us will give us a miracle story. I will call you when I'm pregnant. So that's a very natural way, in a very kind of aggressive way of doing that thing where you're coming out of agreement with a lie and into agreement with what you know is true. Every single month where I wasn't pregnant, I would go to my Bible and I would read scriptures about kids. I would read, children are an inheritance from the Lord. Well, fantastic. If children are an inheritance from the Lord, inheritance is totally not about good behavior. So, and you can't earn them. Inheritance is just about something that's given, and it all comes down to timing. So I would be in agreement with that. Children are an inheritance from the Lord. So I think, wherever you're at in life or whatever you're believing for, your agreement is really important. And it's sometimes a good thing to go back and go, hang on, what am I in agreement with? Am I in agreement with the fear of missing out? Or am I in agreement with that God knows the plans he has for me to bring me a future and a hope? Am I in agreement with I will see the goodness of God in the land of the living? What am I in agreement with?
There's another thing I love that you do to showcase your agreement. And I know we're going a little out of order. We're actually going to go back to the story of your husband, which I know
Sure.
you've told several times, but it's going to be new to an audience here. And
And, I tell bits and pieces of it, and so then people kinda go and collect the mosaic of it
yeah, yeah,
in
and I
podcast
will
world
I will
anyway.
link up to in the show notes to the other podcasts I've listened to Mia on because it is so every time I listen, the Holy Spirit highlights something new
Oh,
for me to
I
take.
love
So
that about him.
I do too. God's a really good highlighter.
He
And,
sure is.
so, okay, one thing that you do, and we're gonna talk about, waiting for your daughter. You do things in the natural that represent what you believe, because if God has said it, then it's gonna happen, so you and your husband put up a crib.
Oh, yeah. We bought a crib, and we bought an expensive crib, and actually there's a backstory to the crib as well, a follow-up story, I should say. Okay, so I do things in the natural because I think one of the enemies of faith is your flesh getting in the way. And so sometimes doing something in the natural pushes your flesh and forces your flesh to get into agreement, because sometimes you can be in agreement in your heart, but your flesh is like, mm. So I've just become a big believer of do something in the natural to force your flesh to go in the direction that you want it to go in. So one thing we did was I basically got diagnosed with very large fibroids, where I quickly kind of found out that my womb had grown to 20 weeks pregnant. I had two very large tumors in there, and they were going to have to do a C-section to cut them out, which is it's a very weird thing to check into hospital knowing you're going to have a C-section and walk out empty-handed. That's a very weird thing to do. And a little bit, for a woman, I think a little bit traumatic, could have been more traumatic than it was, except that when we found out about those tumors, we went and bought a crib. Because at the same time we found out about those tumors, I had had a dream literally the night before where God had shown me, myself in a doctor's surgery. And the doctor was saying, you're 20 weeks pregnant with twins. One is bigger and one is smaller. And I remember being freaked out and saying, is everything okay? Is everything okay? And the doctor put his hands on my shoulders and he said, everything is going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay. And, obviously the next day we found out about the tumors. My uterus was 20 weeks, the size of a 20-week pregnancy. So right then, I can either see that as a random dream or I can see it for what it is. And that's God going, I've got this. Before you have to walk any of it out, I've got this. And so I went into that surgery in agreement with no, God's got this. And the night before the surgery, God whispered to me, I'm going to take your story from a beautiful story to a miracle story, which I was like, oh no, that means I'm going to need a miracle. But I also was like, yay, I'm going to get a miracle. So I'm a big believer of instead of praying for a promise, pray from one and operate from one. So, we're operating from the promise of everything is going to be okay and we're going to get a miracle story. And because we know that, we go and buy a crib. I go on Crate and Barrel and because I was that's the nicest crib store I can think of. So I go on Crate and Barrel and I find this awesome crib. And, if you know me, my house is it's quite modern and black and it's got black and white and wood, So I was I need to find a black crib that's got some wood on it. Well, it's the first crib that pops up. And the crib is I'm going to tell you how much the crib was, not because I'm want people to know, but because it's got a good story on the back end. Okay. So I would never normally spend this on a crib, but I was it's a faith investment. So it was $1,000, which I think is too much to pay for a crib. Beside the point. Anyway, we did that. We buy the crib, we set the crib up. So the crib is set up in our house for far longer than a crib should be set up, especially when you're not pregnant. But it gave us something to look at and something to go when people would come over, they would be oh, are you guys pregnant? We're we will be, we will be. And some people thought we were crazy, and that kind of just egged me on a little bit more. Often if people think you're crazy and if people don't get it, it's usually a good sign that you're on the right journey as far as faith goes. Even last night, I shared something with someone about a new project, a new idea that's totally just bonkers that I've started. And you can tell their eyes glazed over and they're that's nice. And I was this means it's going to work because you don't get it. So this means it's like going to work. So I think it's good to do something in the natural. Sometimes the thing in the natural can even be, one thing I used to do when I was believing for to get married is I would either be the person that buys the most expensive and the best present on a wedding registry intentionally. And then on days that like can be a bit like sad, for like single people, and I don't want to pretend like, oh, you're just, single people everywhere are just, sad because they, Valentine's Day. No, it is disappointing on Valentine's Day or on like a birthday or on like a holiday where you were like alone. Like that is hard. So like those days I would either go and celebrate the heck out of somebody else, or I would go and buy like flowers for other girls that I knew that were single and like place value on them. And I think that's a great way to push your flesh out of the way and be like, because self-pity, God doesn't really respond to it. Like God responds to gratitude, God responds to celebration, and God responds to you sowing seed in other people, not realizing it's sowing seed in your own destiny. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of do something in the natural.
It's just okay. So finish the crib. What's the? You told me the
okay.
money
So the other half story of the crib is okay. So this is quite funny. I've said it's quite funny, and now if it's not funny, then like I'm just
gonna
set
laugh
it up for
anyway.
a fail. Okay, so we end up having a baby. Her name's Booth. Obviously, she ends up sleeping in the bassinet in our room until she's like, I don't know, like 10 months, and so she never really used the crib for the first 10 months. Well, so then I was like, doesn't matter. It's a beautiful crib and it's a faith crib, So then we try to put her in it and she's like, nah, I'm not really interested. And she gets like a little cold one night. She has like a really small nose.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, well, I kind of wanted to sleep in my bed so I can hear her breathing. Then straight after that, we go to Australia and she slept with me in the bed in Australia. So by the time we got back from Australia, she's like, I don't sleep in a crib. I sleep with you. So that kid has been co-sleeping for the last like 9 months, which actually we sort of love. I always thought I wouldn't be a co-sleeping parent, but it's actually been very sweet. So don't come at me, baby wisers. But then anyway, so we have this beautiful crib that's a faith crib that we spent a bunch of money on. That kid has never slept in the bassinet, in the crib ever. So I think, I never normally sell things on Facebook Marketplace. I normally just like find someone who needs it. But I was like, it's a brand new expensive crib. The spiritual significance of the crib is going to bless somebody. So I was like, well, maybe I'll just sell it on Facebook Marketplace. So I go back on Crate and Barrel and I Google searched the crib to see how much it's worth. Well, because I've forgotten like what we paid for it. Well, the crib has been recalled because it has a massive safety issue. So like if I had put Booth in there anyway, like the bottom falls out and collapses on the kid. So like I called Crate and Barrel and I was like, oh my gosh, I was going to sell this crib, but I see it's been recalled. And they're like, oh yeah, we'll come pick it up and give you your money back. So number one, my kid didn't sleep in a crib because it would have ended up being dangerous. Anyway, number two, I got my investment back, didn't I?
Oh my word.
So, I think sometimes God will like make you step out in faith with something and he'll give it back to you anyway.
He's such a full circle God. I pray for full circle moments. They're my favorite stories to hear.
Crib is such a silly thing, but when you think about like, I had tumors and like a C-section and tumors and no baby in my hands. And what God gave me was an opportunity to do something in faith to keep believing what he had said. Then he not only gave me the thing I was believing for, which was a baby and a beautiful baby. I'm sorry, but my baby is beautiful. I know every parent says that, but she's a real sweet little punk in that one. I got the thing I was believing for. And then the investment that I made or the thing that I'd stepped out in faith, God gave that back to me anyway. Like,
that's just so him. Like it just has Jesus stamped all over it.
Yeah. It's so sweet. For some people it has Jesus stamped all over it. For some other people, they'll see it as all just coincidence, And I think, you've got to make sure that you're not looking at life through like eyes that are so disappointed and so badly don't want to be disappointed that you're always trying to dumb things down, I'm always like, if people have had a bad experience, I go, oh my gosh, what a great opportunity to get your hope up and like to like risk it all again, go for it, because disappointment will keep your world so small.
Yeah. In fact, I see that we're coming up on our time here, and so I'm
Are
gonna
we? Oh
ask
my
you to,
gosh.
well, we're for one episode, but I'm going to ask you to stick around for episode number 2 because we haven't talked
Sure.
yet about your story of Joran, and that actually involves disappointment and an area that the
Oh,
Lord
yeah.
healed in you. So we're gonna wrap it up on this one, but obviously I need you to stick around, and so yeah, stay tuned for part 2.